Wonderful, wonderful. So we have feels like we have that whole chorus in the room with us. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Clara Moisello. She is originally from Italy and is a trainer and member of the Executive Council of the New York City Center for Nonviolent Communication. Clara came to the US in 2006 to pursue her doctoral studies in neuroscience research at CUNY. However, during this period, she met the founder of the New York Center for Nonviolent Communication, Tom Bond, and then began practicing and training and facilitating groups and workshops, which then led her to this major life change and career shift. So Clara's passion for neuroscience informs and inspires her activities in nonviolent communication, and we're just delighted to have her here today to work with us. But before we get to Clara, we have a couple of quotes, and I'm bad, but I didn't call people ahead of time to see if you would like to read. So if you don't mind, I will ask, I wonder if my regulars, Tasha, are you there? Will you read the first quote for us, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
NVC, nonviolent communication, was designed to keep us in a dance with other people. A dance in which the whole purpose is to let what happens between us happen according to a rhythm of compassion, where the only energies that are going on between us are the ones in which we nurture one another and are nurtured by each other. And that if we catch ourselves getting out of that dance, this practice is our way of helping us get back into it. To engage in that dance with people is what NVC is all about. Marshall Rosenberg.
Thanks. And Christiane, are you there? Would you mind reading the second one?
I'm here and I will read it.
Thank you.
Compassion is the opening, welcoming, non-judgmental, spacious awareness of the heart. When we discover and open ourselves to this quality of being, we live with compassion. Robert Gonzalez.
Thank you so much, readers. And Clara, hello and welcome. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the beautiful version of the song. It brought me to tears. That was so beautiful, and so thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Vandra, you're muted. There you go.
It's all yours, love.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. Thank you so much again for having me, and so I'll try to condense in this time we have together as best as I can my understanding of this practice. And the time we have is going to be itself a little bit of a challenge, but I'll do my best. And so without further ado, let me dive into it. And then I know we'll have time for some questions at the end. And thanks, Vandra, for the introduction to me as well. Thank you so much. So I'm going to share some slides with you to help me guide through this time. And can you confirm just, Vandra, that I have about 35 minutes, you said, right? Perfect. Okay, here we go. All right. So you already met Marshall through his first song that was shared, and so I also like to start any presentation of this work by acknowledging him, who's really the person at the heart of this work. And Marshall was trained as a clinical psychologist, and he then a bit like me, stepped out of the academic environment and went on to develop this body of work that we now know as nonviolent communication, but it really took a while to shape up the way we know it today. And so several decades, Marshall worked and traveled all over the world, really on the ground, so to speak, to work with in pretty intense areas of conflict and challenge. And over the years, the work slowly emerged. And I like to start by reading another quote from him that I feel captures a bit of the original inquiry that then led him to this exploration that in turn then turned into the work of nonviolent communication. So I'll read it first and then briefly comment on that. So Marshall says, believing that it is in our nature, pardon, there's a siren, of course, great timing, maybe you don't hear it, New York City. Believing that it is in our nature to enjoy giving and receiving in a compassionate manner, I have been preoccupied most of my life with two questions. What happens to disconnect us from our compassionate nature, leading us to behave violently? And then on the other hand, what allows some people to stay connected to their compassionate nature, even under the most trying circumstances? So as I read and receive this quote, for me, it really brings me in touch to the fact that as we look at our spectrum of human behavior, I think we can see we can see these two extremes and everything in between. Vandra was, as she was introducing us to this platform, was mentioning the example of the number of mass shootings happening in the US, such tragic reality of how we can see such extreme expressions of violence, and then probably a lot more nuanced ones as well that are part of our lives. And then I hope that on the other end, we have all experienced, either in ourselves or also on the receiving end, of acts of true compassion and generosity, of the joy that we can experience when we really give from the heart with no purpose other than contributing to life. And so how do we hold that? And really, how can we ask ourselves, what moves us on this continuum? And so this feels to me this question that then moved Marshall really to explore as to what engenders violence in our behavior if we believe, as he says, that we also have this potential in us, potential for compassion and potential for that tapping into that joy of contributing to one another. Pardon me. And so in the course of his exploration, I think Marshall got in touch with really how the language we use has a profound impact on moving us on this continuum. And in fact, and we will see this also later in another of the songs offered, one of Marshall's core and maybe most well-known quotes that in some of the other languages where NVC is shared is also sometimes the title of his most popular book, is that the words are windows or they're walls. So words can open that doorway or that window towards connection, or they can really put a wall, creating enemy images, creating distance. And sometimes as I read this, I also think words sometimes can also be weapons, I think. They can really pierce through, they can really hurt. And so we can even take a moment and reflect. As I share this, I invite you even to think in yourself, what are some forms of communication that tend to block the flow of compassion and disconnect us? Sometimes we are so immersed in this that we may not even be fully aware of them. And so we can think of a language of criticism and blame, the language of that is kind of inducing guilt and shame, the use of our power over other people through demands and coercion, the use of threats and punishment as a way to make change happen and to address problematical behaviors. And then these last two are a little more subtle because we may not immediately be aware of how they can impact the level of connection that we experience. But all the language of moralistic judgments, I think Marshall was making a reference in the first video that was shared on how the good guys, the bad guys, right? Moralistic judgments tend to create this polarization. There's right and there's wrong. There's good and bad people. And so somehow this implicitly conveys the idea of separatedness and the idea that based on our behaviors, we can be put in different boxes. And so if you and I happen to be in the same one, then that might not be too much of an issue. But the moment we meet someone that's not, let's say, in our same group, then working from this idea of moralistic judgments can create distance and disconnection. The last one I'll share is even more subtle. And Marshall would call this last one a language that denies responsibility. And it's all the language of should, shouldn't, I'm supposed to do this is what I have to do, which is, it's a sort of language that, if you're willing, disconnects us from really the source of our behavior, as if it was something that comes from some sort of external pressure or authority or belief system that this is what I have to do. And then finally, there's a ... as to imply you can do your own sort of inner inquiry as to the other experiences of language that you had in your life that tend to create that disconnection. Vandra in the introduction mentioned that I come from academia and I was there for almost a decade doing research. And I know that in that environment, like in many others, this language and these forms of communication were almost all I knew and all I was immersed in. And of course, that goes beyond the work environment to many others, right? And so what else? What if we are so familiar with this? What can be a different language that instead engenders connection and brings us closer to each other? Well, this is exactly what NVC tries to answer. So if those forms of communication, if you can agree that those tend to separate us, then NVC in a way tries to convey a set of concepts and practices that create a different map, a map that can support us to form new habits of thinking and language, because as you can imagine, thinking and languages are really intimately connected. And these new habits are designed to serve a very specific intention. And this is really important to me. It's the idea that the intention of NVC is creating a quality of connection, either with other people or with ourselves, that can enable our natural compassion to flourish. To me, this is a very important way to frame this work, because in other contexts, and even in the original way that Marshall presented it, and it's often brought, and if some of you are already familiar with this work, as it's often proposed as a language model with certain components, and some of them we'll talk about. And because of that, sometimes people may forget the intention that animates that. The language skills are ways to direct our attention to that place, to that shared humanity that we have in common. And words, as you can imagine, any kind of words can be used with different intent. So I invite us to keep in mind that first and foremost, the skills that we practice in NVC are geared towards open the door of our heart and reaching into the heart of another being, as I try to capture with this image. And that can be our inner compass, and it's sort of almost a litmus test to see, is this working? Is this helping me? And also starting from an inner place where we start by changing the way we look at ourselves and others in a different way. And so I will do my best to share what are some of the elements, what do we pay attention to in NVC? So as you saw in the previous slide, often we pay attention to who's right and who's wrong, and who's good and bad, and so on and so forth. In NVC, we try to pay attention to something else. And before stepping into what do we pay attention to, I also like to name the fact that we can really bring this work into various directions, maybe starting with how we communicate with ourselves, because sometimes, and I don't know if you'd agree, that's the place where we can be the harshest and the most judgmental towards our own behaviors. So that's a good starting place. And then from there, we can move towards the relationships, the immediate relationships in our lives, our partners, our kids, our colleagues, our friends, and cultivate a way to have connected dialogues, collaborative relationships, and so on. And then from there, maybe comes a more daunting and also, in a way, broader challenge, which is the one of bringing these principles in the larger scope of our systems, our worlds, our way to inhabit this planet together, a planet and a world that's often, if not to say always, is really in this day and age, built on principles that are other than compassionately supporting one another, but it's often really expressing more of a core idea of, again, being separate beings, needing to compete, needing to fight one another in a way to navigate certain aspects of our lives. And so as we move through learning these skills, I like to keep these in mind, not so much as necessarily a progression, but also something that we can keep in our heart, because if we wait to have it all together within ourselves, I think good luck, because this is a life journey. So I like to really keep in mind that we can work together on all these levels. And I think especially the mission of organizations and communities like Brooklyn Ethical are deeply committed on supporting all of these levels at once and creating a more compassionate world, starting from each individual. And so now I'll step into drawing this map of what do we, if we don't talk about judgments, if we don't talk about who's right and wrong, what do we talk? How do we talk? And where do we direct our attention? So there's a core idea at the heart of nonviolent communication. And the way the idea can be stated is that NVC invites us to consider that everything we do, any human behavior, anything that I do or have ever done, anything that you do or you have ever done, can be seen as an attempt to meet universal human needs. So everything we do to meet certain needs. Or we can look at it as an expression of needs. And I let you hold it for a moment. We'll get into a couple of examples shortly. But before then, I also care to share that I don't claim this to be the truth or not. It's a way to see things. And we will see that from this seemingly very simple statement, there can be profound repercussions that I'll hope to try to capture in what follows. So before looking into a couple of examples, I want to have us, share a way that where we can define what do we mean by needs exactly. In nonviolent communication, the definition we use might be a little different than maybe how we are commonly used to this word. So let me articulate it with you. So in NVC, needs describe those qualities that we all want to experience in a full human life. You can see them as the fundamental motivators for all our actions. So I draw your attention to this word qualities. So needs are not things, they're not people, they're not behaviors, they're not something tangible. There's energetic qualities we long for in order to live a full life. And so this means more than the basic necessities of life, like air, water, shelter, sustenance, safety. Sometimes when it say needs, those one show up as those primary needs that truly we would not survive for, or at least we wouldn't survive for a long time if those needs were to not be met. However, as humans, we also need other qualities in order to survive or to live fully. Needs for love, for companionship, for respect, for autonomy, for peace, connection, meaning, contribution, and so on and so forth. Many qualities. And actually, maybe later on when I post the slideshow, I'll share with you a need inventory that we use commonly in our work to try to start becoming familiar with the language of needs, of these qualities that our heart longs for. And so by the way of how we define needs, we can say needs are considered to be universal. These qualities, no matter how we call them, the words we use to describe them, are something we all share. We may share them in different layering and in different priorities at different times of our lives. But I think if you were to look at that list that I'll give you in a moment, I don't think there's anything of these qualities, let's say, that I mentioned, at least even the ones I mentioned here, that we could say, oh no, that one I don't really need. It's part of being alive, and in a way, as I said, they capture needs concepts or needs words, try to capture what we have in common as humans. And then the important distinction, so based on this, based on how we have defined needs, then we can see that needs are different than strategies. And when I use the word strategies, I mean all the things we do, or all the objects we use, all the words we say sometimes in order to meet needs. So the strategies are, if you're willing, the tangible part, the things we see, the things we say, the things we use, the things we do. And we will see this distinction is really critical, because our strategies or behaviors, that's where our diversity lies, right? Our great differences in preferences, in choices, in how we meet our needs. And so they're both, they're both incredibly important. It's sometimes important to look for the needs to find what we have in common, but we then need to go back to strategies in order to see, okay, what do we want to do together to address those needs? But keep in mind this distinction. And actually, I'll share just a couple of simple examples. And this can range from the most, simple and trivial things, like I scratch my head maybe to relieve a need for comfort, or mostly, yes, comfort, to relieve an itch, and so to have a sense of well-being, let's say. Or I can use an object like a cell phone. We say I need a cell phone, but truly we don't need it, but we use it in order to meet needs for communication, connection, entertainment. And you can think of others as well in your head. We can think as actions such as having a job or going to work. What needs does that meet? Well, probably a need for financial stability and social security. Sometimes a need for contribution, maybe a need for meaning, maybe a need for community and purpose. If we're very lucky, even a need for fun and engagement, and so on. We can think about things we like to do. Like, let's say I go and take a walk in Prospect Park, and I'm there in between the trees. And that going there for me is often an attempt to get relaxation, beauty, space, communion with nature, even in the middle of a city like New York. And so I hope these examples start making that connection. And usually, as far as the behaviors are not particularly controversial, this doesn't seem to be too much of a big deal. I imagine that as you were listening to me, you were hearing these needs, and I'm hoping that they may make sense and they didn't stir any particular feelings in you. The place where these concepts start really being, having a potential for a true impact is when we start to look at behaviors that we don't like to see, behaviors that may cause harm to ourselves or to others, behaviors that we would call violent. And these, again, can range from the very extreme, I think what Vendra mentioned in the beginning, of something as extreme as a mass shooting, from something as less extreme, like, I don't know, answering in a rough way to our partner or criticizing a colleague, let's say. Those behaviors, for as hard as it can be and to see them, if we were to look really deeper, let's say beyond the behavior itself, down there somewhere, we will find that also those behaviors are very tragic sometimes, attempt to meet a need or to express an unmet need. I imagine very often in the moment we look to the stories of people like that have done brutal actions, such as the shootings, we sometimes find mental health issues, problematic, his past history, pain, basically, pain, disconnection, exposure to challenging ideologies. And so the behavior that shows up, then, it takes a while to dig back and find, okay, so what needs were not met there, or what does the behavior can be, in a way, a very tragic attempt to be heard or to be seen, a very tragic attempt to release pain or release anger. And sometimes in different situations, like maybe if I imagine, I don't know, punching someone or wanting to, sometimes it can even be an attempt to protect myself. So to me, the need for safety and security. Sometimes it can be an attempt to maybe meet needs for effectiveness. Let's say when we talk to in some demanding ways to our colleagues or peers. I'm taking a breath here to let you absorb for a moment these ideas. So why do I say that looking at this way, at these problematic, I'm going to put them in quotes, behaviors, that looking in this way can make a difference? Well, for two reasons, I would say. So the first one is that once we look at the needs that are expressed in the behaviors, we have that bridge into shared humanity. No matter how tragically someone is expressing their needs, underneath, we're all humans, and we can see any person as someone who's just like me, who's trying to meet their needs, who's trying to navigate life. Sometimes, unfortunately, creating a lot of harm around. The other consequence is what I call there can be different approaches to creating change. Okay? So I see something that's not working. I think we see plenty, honestly, that's not working. And then what we're most commonly used to do is what we can summarize as the idea of a punitive approach to creating change. The punitive approach to creating change says, okay, something is happening that I'm not liking, okay, in myself sometimes or in other people. Well, then I will judge it, I will criticize it, I will use punishment or threat as a way to change it, to make the person or myself change what I'm doing. And that change then will often happen out of guilt, fear of the consequences, a sense of obligation and having no choice. And Marshall would say, whenever behavior changes in this way, everybody pays for it. It's not going to be a sustainable change most likely. There's going to be resentment. It's going to be coming from a consciousness which is possibly the same one that we're trying to change. And so the other way, sometimes I call this one a top-down way to make change happen. The alternative to that is what we could call a restorative approach to create change. And sometimes it's more of a bottom-up. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to flip the arrows upwards. Pardon me, my PowerPoint limitations, but I wish I could have flipped them, and this being the bottom of the slide. So the restorative starts from the same thing. I'm seeing something that's problematic, that I'm not liking, that is dangerous, or fill the blanks with what you wish. Well, now what I do is I try to understand what are the needs, both the needs that are not being met, because if I'm not liking this behavior, it means that it's not meeting needs for me. It's either threatening my safety, my well-being, my sense of shared reality, my sense of choice, and so on and so forth. So I want to understand, why is that not working for me? But I also want to understand, why is that working for the other person, so to speak? So why are they behaving in that way? And then once I try to understand that one, and once I check with the other person, then what I can do is try to brainstorm and suggest new strategies, new ways to meet those needs that can meet even more needs in some ways, that can hopefully take into account both my needs and the needs of the other person. They can do a better job. One of my teachers and trainer, Miki Kashtan, often says that once we get in touch with both these sets of needs, then it becomes a matter of creativity. What can we do? We have infinite possibilities to meet needs. So chances are there are gonna be ways that I can take both of these needs into account. Sometimes I think about, in this context, about if we think of, like, for example, addictive behaviors, or they are tragic attempts to meet certain needs, right? They The unmet needs in those cases probably are for, again, for health and well-being down the road, and also for, let's say, self-respect, if you're willing. And they may also create harm for others as well. But those behaviors try to meet needs. Maybe they're attempts to relieve pain. Maybe they're attempts to have sense of belonging and inner peace and escape maybe from pain. So if we don't address the underlying need, any change that happens is likely to be not sustainable and not coming from the true joy to contribute to one another. So needs. So one first place where we try to put our attention and center our language on needs. Unfortunately, I think most of our language is far from being centered on needs still, and it's much more centered on all those forms of communication that we can group under the label of judgments. And I feel like this is still so pervasive. Open any social media, open any news source, and you will see a lot more of this than needs. I hope we agree, even if I'm not seeing you in wherever you are, but I hope we can agree on that. Now, interestingly, we can see that we can find a connection between judgments, the judgment language, and needs. As I said, even the words we speak can be seen as an attempt to meet needs. And if you look at this cartoon for a moment and imagine the character there is saying or wants to say, "You're the most self-centered person I know." So a judgment, a criticism, an accusation. Can we take a moment just to recognize that if we were on the receiving end of that, it would probably be something that it doesn't invite us in, right? So if we ask, however, or if we ask ourselves, or even what do we think this character is needing when they say what they said? What are they needing, really? Well, I'm imagining, if I take that on, if I imagine it for myself, then maybe that person is needing consideration, maybe support, maybe to be heard, mutuality, care. And again, let me go back to that. And there can be more. These were just my guesses. You may guess different needs as well. So you start to see that it's almost like a parallel universe, sometimes I call it. I can think judgments and I can unpack it to find what needs are expressed there. Marshall also used to say that any word of judgment or criticism is a tragic attempt to meet needs. And it's tragic because if I speak this way, well, most likely there's gonna be disconnection, defensiveness, and so on and so forth. If I instead center my communication on how can we have more support in our relationship, how can we have more sense of care, mutuality, and so on, well, then the chances to stay connected increase. And so we can see that there's a way to move from the outer circle to the inner circle. There's another layer in between these two that can often contribute also to enrich the experience, and is the layer of feelings. So feelings are another way that we become aware of when our needs are met or not met, because feelings give us the most immediate response from our body. If our needs are met, we feel good, quote unquote. We feel something pleasant. If our needs are not met, but generally the experience is unpleasant. Fear, anger, sadness, fatigue. So there is a connection, there is a relationship also between feelings and needs. And so I'm going to skip quickly on this slide because of the sake of time, but I can make the slides available to anyone who participated. So with the language of feelings, what we try, yeah?
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt and say, yes, let's make this the last couple of slides. And then we'll
Yes.
come back for some Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I was accelerating. The last two I really want to share. So I'll go a bit quickly on this in saying that feelings also are a way to become aware and connect to our needs. So they carry important information. So let me try to give you a glimpse to how you can transform criticism and judgment language. And this is kind of trying to give you a quick run through how I would work with my NVC practice to address a situation where, for example, I'm leaning into talking in terms of judgment. Well, first of all, I would catch myself when I'm about to do that. And I would slow down and say something as, okay, I'm noticing I'm activated. I need to pause. I need to slow down. And then I will go inwards and try to find these three elements. Whenever I unpack a judgment, I can find three main things. I can find what I call the stimulus, or what is happening. What is happening out there that is stimulating me? What is this other person doing? I can look at feelings. I'm imagining if I were to think this way, there might be feelings of hurt, of resentment, of loneliness, of upset. And then I can look at needs. And needs we already named before can be needs for care, mutuality, companionship, and so on. So I do this work internally first. I want to get in touch, as this what we would call the work of self-empathy in NVC. Once I am aware of this, then I can center my communication on these qualities that I've discovered. So instead of talking about how self-centered you are, I can talk about what is happening. And so try to articulate my observation, my perception of what is going on that is affecting me. I can share how I'm feeling about it and where those feelings come from, because whenever we have feelings, we're something that matters for us. And so I'm going to center my communication on this. And then finally, I will try to make suggestions or requests that can work better to meet these needs. And so I can express based on these elements, and I can listen for these elements. So it's always a dialogue. It's always a two-way street in NVC. I can listen for these qualities even when they're not explicitly expressed in how people say. It's going to be very rare when you go in, even when you start learning NVC and start practicing it. It's very rare that you're going to meet other people that in the world that are going to express themselves based on these elements. And so in NVC, we also train our ears, not just our mouth. And actually, I want to say, we train our ears before training our mouths. We learn to listen beyond the words. Marshall would say, don't listen to what people say. You're going to age faster if you listen to the exact words that people say. Listen beyond the words. Listen for their heart. Listen for their pain. Listen for what is happening in their life. And so then NVC practice becomes a dance of listening and expressing, listening and expressing. And that's the dance. You remember the quote from before. That's the dance of compassion. That's the dance of peace. And so here I'm going to pause and come back to you. I've left also a quote that I really love also attributed to Viktor Frankl, which is the idea that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And that's in that space that we have a power to choose our response. And in our ability to respond lies our growth and our freedom. So we move away from habitual reactivity and move towards choiceful response. So creating that space is probably one of the greatest skills that we can cultivate in this work. And then I left you some resources and some books that maybe the Vandra and the team can share with you if it's helpful. So here I am. Back to you.
Thank you.